So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today and for being part of this important conversation on food security in Saskatoon during a pandemic. My name is Erin Wolfson, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist with the College of Medicine and the Division of Social Accountability at the University of Saskatchewan. And if you can hear some whimpering in the background, that is my toddler who is fighting a nap right now. So apologies if it's distracting. I'll turn off my microphone. I'll mute myself once we get started. I would like to acknowledge the land that we are on. I am located here on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis, and we acknowledge Saskatchewan as the traditional territory of First Nations and Métis people, which includes Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, and 10. And we acknowledge Indigenous peoples as an ongoing and current stewards of this land. So wherever you may be joining us from, please do your own silent acknowledgement of the traditional people who inhabit the territory that you live on, where you live. Before I introduce our moderator for today's conversation, I just want to share a little bit about this series. If this is the first time joining us, this webinar is part of a series of online community conversations hosted by the Division of Social Accountability. And this is the fourth conversation we've hosted in the series, taking a deeper look at pressing and emerging health equity issues facing our communities right now during COVID-19. So as opposed to a more structured webinar, we do see these community conversations as an opportunity to bring a local lens to many of the conversations around similar topics. In Saskatoon, through the Saskatoon Interagency Response to COVID-19, agencies have come together across systems and sectors to raise questions and coordinate actions while centering the needs and lived experience of people living in vulnerable circumstances. And so through this series, we're trying to profile this really incredible collaboration and effort. And our conversation today features some of the people and agencies that are involved. We hope through these conversations to discuss concrete actions to meet the needs and support populations who perhaps are disproportionately affected by the crisis, while at the same time inviting reflection on what COVID-19 might be teaching us to help sow the seeds for long-term transformative change. We sincerely hope that these conversations, or people will leave these conversations feeling perhaps more hopeful for what is possible, perhaps more supported in their learning about what is happening and in their efforts to serve communities. So finally, while we're using a webinar platform, and I recognize for some people it is a bit uncomfortable not being able to see everybody, we do hope you view it as a conversation. So please do share any questions or comments or resources that you have on this topic in the chat. And as I mentioned earlier, you may not have seen, or when I mentioned it, there is a little tab. I believe if you press more, you can do so. Thank you so much also in advance for those who had submitted questions in advance. We actually got quite a few for this conversation, so we really appreciate it. And without further ado, I'd just like to invite, or introduce rather, our moderator for this conversation, Dr. Rachel Engler-Stringer, who is well known to many of you. She's an associate professor in the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan and a researcher with the Saskatchewan Population Health and Evaluation Research Unit. She is currently the chair of the Saskatoon Food Council. She's a doctorate in nutrition, and her research interests include community food security, food environments, and food access, food system sustainability, health promotion, and community-based and participatory research. Rachel's passion for food extends beyond academic, where she loves to learn and teach about all things food related. She's an avid cook and takes great satisfaction from growing her own food in her inner city front and backyards. So thank you so much for being here with us and leading us in this very important conversation. And I'll pass it over to you, Rachel, to get us started.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to assume that unless I hear something otherwise that you can hear me. This is always a bit awkward online to not be able to see the audience, but I can see fellow panelists, so that's good. So I wanted to very briefly start with a couple of definitions, just talk a little bit about what we mean by food security, just so that we're all on the same page when we're having this conversation. So food security at the household level, so we tend to define it around food insecurity, and that's because food security is relatively aspirational in that there's a lot of reasons why we could argue that our communities and nations aren't fully food secure. So household food insecurity is limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or limited or uncertain ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways. So that's just the straight up definition. What I like to emphasize when I talk about that definition is it's got 4 sort of domains. Quantitative, which is what people typically think of when they think of hunger, so not having enough food, but of course that's quite narrow. Qualitative in terms of the quality of food, being able to eat a relatively varied diet, not always eating the same things, which is often what we see in food insecure households. A social domain, which is about both how we acquire food, so do we need to access charity in order to acquire the foods that we need, but also about, there's some elements of cultural acceptability in there, although to be honest, the definitions that are used most frequently and where we measure food insecurity don't do a very good job of capturing cultural aspects of food insecurity. And then the 4th is psychological, and that has to do with things like the kinds of anxieties, the sometimes fixation on food that people experience when they're living with food insecurity. So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time talking to you about kind of what this looks like. So what I will simply say is that according to the best available data that we have, prior to this crisis, we had somewhere around 12.7% of households who were considered to be food insecure. And now that data is quite limited. It comes from the Canadian Community Health Survey. It's limited because it does not include on reserve Indigenous people. It also does not include people in the military, people in prisons. There's a number of groups that are not included in that data. What I can tell you about on reserve Indigenous, on reserve food insecurity is that the best data we have from the First Nations Food, Nutrition and Environment Study tells us that about 37% of people living on reserve in Saskatchewan, at least, are food insecure. So those are the numbers. I could tell you a lot more about what food insecurity looks like in terms of statistics and in terms of basic characteristics, but that's where I'm going to leave it for right now. I would like to pass on to our speakers. And I might say more later, but for now, that's what I'd like to, that's what I'll share. So I was going to go, if it's okay with the speakers, in the order in which the bios appear for me. So that means that Laurie would go first. So I will tell you a little bit about Laurie. So really what we're going to do is give each of our speakers, so Laurie, Jean, Chelsea, and Jolyn, a chance to talk about what their roles are in responding to some of the emergency issues that have arisen since, when it comes to food insecurity, since the pandemic began here in Saskatoon. And so we're gonna go around, give everyone about 5 minutes to talk about their role and what they've been involved with. And then I will ask some of the questions that have been submitted to us and give everyone a chance to answer as they wish. So Laurie O'Connor is the Executive Director of the Saskatoon Food Bank and Learning Centre. During her teen years, Laurie's volunteer work with a small town food bank in Ontario strongly shaped her values and beliefs, inspiring her to devote her career to making a difference in people's lives. Raised by educators with a strong commitment to community development, she is well known for her passion for poverty reduction and her belief that hunger is a solvable problem. Laurie promotes healthier communities through advocacy at municipal, provincial, and national levels. Laurie is also the Executive Director of Food Banks of Saskatchewan, and she serves on the Fundraising Advisory Committee with Food Banks Canada, and she's involved with the leadership group for the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership, Poverty Reduction Partnership, pardon me. Laurie believes that food banks must focus not on doing things better, but doing things differently. Under her leadership, the Saskatoon Food Bank and Learning Centre has become an innovative leader in developing programs and partnerships that disrupt the status quo and actively work toward food security and poverty reduction. Welcome, Laurie.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll submit a shorter bio next time because that took a really long time to read. Right at the beginning of the COVID crisis, we started talking about our fears for the community and how we would respond in ways that made it safe for folks to access services at our building, but also to be able to stay home. So we shuttered most of our programs except for the food hamper program, and then began to weed through how we would keep staff and visitors to our center safe. So did all of what many of you, of course, have done around cleaning procedures and PPE and those kinds of things. We focused only on the food hamper program so that we could ensure that folks could still have access to that food. We received a large number of donations from both distributors, grocery stores, and restaurants, and we immediately started to get those out to other agencies. So we expected that there would be a large spike in numbers at the food bank, and we certainly have not experienced that. And I think that's a really great thing. I think there are a number of factors which contributed to that. Definitely the other programs in the community which were supporting folks with food and deliveries to their home, and we're really grateful for those. And of course, the government supports that were enacted really quickly, I think also helped folks to feel less like they needed to use the Food Bank and Learning Center's food hamper program. We've seen an influx of donations, though, of mostly fresh foods, which we have had the difficulty of trying to manage. We don't have a ton of cooler space in our building, and so getting that back out to the community was quite a feat. Our other response was to switch to home delivery for those clients who had the most mobility challenges. We have a lot of agencies who requested food boxes to be able to deliver to their clients, and that's how we responded. So 2 days a week, we are responding to those agencies and their clients, and then 2 days a week we were doing home deliveries with the help of Access Transit and Brunner Construction. We know that volunteer labor will soon come to an end, and that we may not be able to continue to deliver individuals food boxes to their homes, but we are working with the lovely other panelists and the great work that they've done to figure out a way to ensure that people can remain safe during the crisis and still receive emergency food.
Thank you, Laurie. Okay, so next in terms of my bios would be Jean. So Jean Goerzen is currently the Interim Executive Director of CHEP Good Food. She has spent a good portion of her career working in community development for health promotion, and specifically with subsistence farmers in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. She thus has an appreciation for the complexities around food security, including gender equity, food policies, and climate change. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, her work with CHEP is focused on food access, particularly for food insecure members of our community, with a parallel focus on food production through gardening now that gardening season is underway. Welcome, Jean.
Thank you. Well, first I'll start out with what we were doing before the pandemic hit. We were bulk buying fresh produce and dairy weekly and delivering to about 25 schools to support their established food programs. And in addition, we were running a centralized kitchen out of North Park Wilson School, preparing nutritious brown bag lunches every day, like over 100, and delivering them to another 20-some schools who do not have established food programs in Saskatoon. So with the pandemic, and also we were running fresh food markets all over Saskatoon, and including in 8 seniors' residences. So what happened with the pandemic is schools closed. That following week, we shifted the centralized kitchen to Station 20 West, and we started producing the brown bag lunches and distributing them through French Pen. We were doing 100 a day and then started 150 a day. And then we shifted to White Buffalo Youth Lodge. They were delivering, and every day we were preparing another 150 to deliver. And we immediately moved into our good food delivery mode, whereby every Wednesday and every Friday, we were no contact delivering. We're up to, well, now about 150 households each time. Now, what happened with the school program was we realized if kids are food insecure, so are their families. And now that they're back with their families, we're not going to feed kids. We need to support the family's food security. So that's where Chelsea Belt and I were one day brainstorming, and we came up with the school family lunchbox, whereby we would just sort of scale up what we would provide for a nutritious lunch and deliver those to families. And we worked with the schools. We're working with 15 community schools as well as Nutana Collegiate. And so we are packing and delivering daily, Monday through Friday, so that over 500 families identified by the schools, by the community coordinators who know the families that are food insecure, get these lunch boxes weekly. So this has basically been the focus. And I should say the interagency cooperation in Saskatoon has been incredible throughout this. There's a lot of support. You know, we have a food security working group, the we're all members of, and it's been really great to have that kind of support, because we have just completely flipped, well, or pivoted, as the word is, our modus operandi. We're operating very, very differently. And then also with gardens, community gardens are going ahead with, we weren't even sure they would get permission from the city to go ahead, but they did. With, like, we were sort of lobbying for community gardens to be basically designated as essential, you know, food service. But the city did allow them to go ahead with COVID-19 restrictions. And then we also have our own gardens here. So we are in the throes of gardening now as well. So yeah, so that's basically what we've been doing for the past 3 months.
Thank you, Jean. Okay, so next is Chelsea Belt. So Chelsea Belt is a public health nutritionist in population health with the Saskatchewan Health Authority. She's also a registered dietitian. She's been working as the food security lead with the Saskatoon interagency response since mid-March. I think, yeah. Go ahead, Chelsea. Welcome.
Hi. Yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk to you. It is weird to not see the people who are actually listening. I'm feeling a bit, this is new for me, I guess. So bear with me, please. It's been so fun. I've had the pleasure of working with the 3 other panelists, as well as a lot of our other food and community organizations since mid-March, and it has been amazing to see the collaboration within both the food and the food security responses, but with many of the other issues that face the people of Saskatoon as well. So the interagency response, for those of you who don't know, is a group of over 50 organizations that came together right away. I guess not all 50 came right away, but the Saskatoon Safe Community Action Alliance sort of pulled some people together, and we ended up with this new structure called the Saskatoon Interagency Response. You can find, when I'm not talking, there, Rod. Thanks, Rod. The website is there, and you can learn all about it. It has lots of resources, and you can learn a little bit more. But what I've been doing is working with all the organizations who are serving food. And I shouldn't say all, because there are some out there who aren't serving massive amounts, but I've been able to work with Laurie in the food bank, and Jean at CHEP, and Jolyn, who will speak after, with White Buffalo, who I think your organization did the largest shift in service related to food response in COVID. So I'm so glad you're here to talk about that and address some of those needs. So like Rachel, I heard in your bio, my focus usually in my work is population health, and that often means really big picture sort of thinking and policy options and all that sort of stuff, which I do get to work on with some of the people that that are speaking here today, but with the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership Food Action Group. And we work towards sort of lasting changes to improve people's food security. But this work has given me the emergency response side, and I have been doing all kinds of urgent and new things for me, and it has been great. I've had the pleasure of coordinating this group, but also trying to arrange for allocations, money to be spent on water bottles and to-go containers, because most people shifted to a to-go model for at least a little bit with food, because just with all the safety measures that were put in place, it was really hard to not produce dishes and those sorts of things. And most places ended up not doing seated meals like they would normally do, and all was to go. So that was one of the major shifts that we saw with sort of the regular emergency food stuff. And I will leave White Buffalo and Jolyn to talk a little bit about the massive delivery effort that happened, and I'm sure some of you followed in the news as well. And I'm trying not to give away too much, because I've just had the pleasure of working with really amazing leaders in our city and in our community organizations that have really come together to meet the need of this time in a really, really unique and different way. And I think I'm going to stop talking because I feel like I'm rambling, and I think I'll have better responses to the questions that come up. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Chelsea. So I wasn't sent a bio for Jolyn, but I just did some quick Googling on him. And I know that Jolyn is the director of the White Buffalo Youth Lodge. I also see that he's really involved in the arts community, and we have some friends in common. But other than that, I don't know much about Jolyn, so I will let him introduce himself and then tell us about what his organization is doing.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to quickly Google myself in the next 5 minutes here. But for the meantime, my name is John LaFond. I'm from the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, which is about 45 minutes north of Saskatoon. I was born and raised there. Did spend part of my youth here in Saskatoon, but I spent a majority of my professional career in Edmonton and returned home here in 2011. I do have a background in recreation youth culture, and if anybody knows Muskeg or Muskeg Lake or aware of Muskeg, we are community-oriented people, and food has always been a part of our culture there. Something that we've been naturally grown into. So with that, on the White Buffalo Youth Lodges and with kind of an Indigenous lens, when the COVID-19 pandemic began, and the state of emergency was announced, we naturally began the process of figuring out how to feed the families that we were closely connected to. And so with that, we started off in identifying which families were attending programming, and not just our programming, but within the White Buffalo Youth Lodge, we also we host SHA programs. We also host City of Saskatoon, City Police programs, as well as some Comfy and Saskatoon Tribal Council programs. So it was already quite a big mix, quite a big group of people that we needed to track down, locate, identify what their needs were. And so with that, we started running. We started prepping meals here. It started off with about 100 meals per day within the White Buffalo Youth Lodge. That quickly grew to 300, and we outgrew our own kitchen. We utilized the Scion kitchen, which is on 11th Street, and that's in the STC Education building. And they began cooking, and we started doing lunches and suppers. We then began working with the Saskatoon Wildlife Federation, and they reached out to us and offered some services and support in creating lunches, and our numbers grew again. And that started off a chain of events, or a whirlwind of events, which began including the Saskatoon Public School Board, the Catholic School Board, and utilizing some of the kitchens that were at their sites, and their staff members quickly jumped on board and naturally started to help out. And I think that really is telltale of Saskatoon in general and Saskatchewan, in that we are community oriented, and we always it's very grassroots level, in that we try to just work within our means and make sure everybody is okay. And so we've been continuing that process up until today. We are seeing a few issues here and there. It's done with the return to normal and the phases. We've seen staff being pulled away to different parts. We're still keeping it up and keeping up our efforts, but it is becoming an issue of transition, and how do we return back to some normalcy, and how do we support families and the food security initiatives within the community, so that there's nobody left behind. I hope that covers a portion of what we're doing over here. I know there is quite a bit more, but for sake of time, I'll keep my mouth shut for a bit more and allow for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now is where we open it up to questions from those of you who are participating, and also questions that have been submitted in advance. So I wanted to ask, I'm just going through the questions here. The first question, I think, because it's a somewhat general question, and I think maybe any of you could speculate or so the question is how has COVID-19 caused or impacted food insecurity? I don't think anybody can say this with certainty, at least from my research or academic standpoint. I don't think I can say anything with certainty. But just from what you've been hearing from the families you work with, perhaps if you can tell us a bit about what people have been experiencing in terms of increasing food insecurity. So go ahead. I'm not going to direct a question at one person, so feel free to just jump in.
Okay, I'll start it off. In regards to food insecurity, I think right in the first month to 2 months, what we've seen is a lack of funds, a lack of resources to access or go out and buy groceries. I know a number of families expressed that right off the bat. Also, due to the initial circumstances surrounding supply chains and the hoarding. I'll just call it for what I've seen it as. But due to the hoarding, there was, because a lot of the people that we deal with, or families that we deal with, are on fixed incomes, they didn't have access to these to the resources to go and gather. And when they did get there to get some food for their families, of course there was nothing available. And they quite frankly said, they were questioning how they were going to feed their kids. They asked us how we could support them. Mainly, with the schools, with not being able to attend school, with the lunches and breakfasts that are provided in school for a lot of the surrounding, the inner city core. They were really scared and struggling with that aspect of it, and that food insecurity piece.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Yes, what Jolyn said, certainly about kids being dependent on school for their food security, and then also seniors, we're another vulnerable group. failed to mention that we were also focused on, we got funds specifically New Horizons for Seniors program so that we can support seniors and survivors and elders. And we are depending on our partners for that. We have a lot of people refer to us. But another thing with seniors was that they were, told basically they were in a high-risk category, so they should certainly be staying home. And when they ventured out, they were completely terrorized by the hoarders. I think everybody was terrorized by the hoarders. And so that was another group that really was starting to fall through the cracks. We heard, interesting personal experiences from seniors. So so that also became a focus for us.
Anyone else?
I would just echo. For me, I would just echo what Jean and Joel are saying, that there was a lot of fear expressed, fear of the virus, and then fear that folks weren't going to be able to access the things they needed to. We heard from a number of folks who use our services quite often just relief and gratitude that we were still open and that we knew of other things that were going on and that we were connected. And then we also had many calls in the first month from folks who had never accessed the food bank's food hamper program, and so just phoning to find out information about how they could use our services if they needed to. So I think, in general, there was an enormous amount of anxiety about how folks were going to meet the needs of their families around food, for sure.
Yeah, and I think given that we know how tightly food insecurity is linked to income, and there's so many people who lost their jobs, especially in those first few weeks. I'm thinking especially of people in the service industry, of course, as we know, those folks don't make a lot of money to begin with, so likely wouldn't have savings, wouldn't necessarily have a lot of money to hold on, had to get through during that period. So, we unemployment rate is still very, very high across the country, and certainly it is here. Does anyone else want to add anything to that, to response to that question? Okay, so one of the questions that was submitted, and to be honest, is one that I've been thinking a lot about personally, is about the transition to summer. And, summer is a complicated and difficult time often for families, especially families who depend on school lunch programs. We know that there have been organizations historically that have sort of stepped up to try to help in the summer months. I've seen a number of them. I live in a neighborhood where those programs come and deliver lunches on a regular basis, and that. So I work a lot in the area of school food, and I'm involved a lot nationally around conversations around school food, and that's been coming up very frequently. Is what is going to happen over the summer. So typically at the end of June, school breakfast and lunch programs wind down. And then there are some programs that run in some neighborhoods over the summer months, but they're very limited and do their best. But there's a lot of people who are missed in the summer months. So I'm wondering what is going to be happening in July and August with your organizations, and how, if you have the resources to do that, to continue and so on.
Well, we intend to wrap up this delivery program by the end of June. And then we're trying to sort of brainstorm ways that we can support the initiatives that are already going on in the summer, and just how we can meet the need in a different way. The deliveries now are becoming more and more difficult. For one thing, we work with volunteers, and now volunteers are sort of dropping away as life is opening up in other areas. And also people aren't home when we no contact deliver, which is kind of the point, in the first place. So we're just looking at a different way. It's distribution is our challenge. How do we distribute? We're looking for ways to continue to provide. In particular, CHEP, we're always focused on nutritious food, like fresh produce, fresh vegetables and fruits, things like that. We're doing a lot of bread and eggs and pantry items and stuff like that. But we are now looking, and we have been brainstorming together with our partners about how can we still meet the need over the summer, just in a way where the distribution is manageable.
I can add to that. So a summer program that usually occurs is through the Saskatoon Labor District Council, and they prep out of a school kitchen, and they deliver to the city programs out in the parks, kind of all over, but more targeted. So we're right now waiting to see what the city is going to do as far as summertime programs, which are in the works. And so we're partnering, there's conversation, and we're including CHEP and the summer snack program from the Saskatoon Labor and District Council to see where we can sort of make sure that the food is available, maybe in concert with those summer programs targeted at youth as well. Obviously, it's not this, it'd be more in line with the regular summer response as opposed to a more intensified version, which we know does miss some folks. But I think the opportunity that the interagency response to COVID has really given us is we are all talking to each other, and we can plan in a much more collaborative way than we have in the past. And what that does is it enables us to really meet the need in a better, more coordinated and consistent way. And I think that we'll see that with the summer response as well, which is currently in the works.
Anyone else want to add anything to that?
I think, it's been really wonderful to have a group of people who are providing food services along the food spectrum in a different way to be conversing through this pandemic, because we've been able to understand, usage levels in our own programs, and then plan for any changes that might occur. So as opposed to planning in isolation for when a school lunch or meal program might change, we've had the opportunity to hear firsthand who's being supported. So not specifically which people, but who's being supported in what areas of the city. And we can now sort of work on a transition plan to help folks.
Thank you, Laurie. So I'm looking at the questions that were submitted, and it's an interesting range of questions. And some of them are about how can we increase access to food generally in Saskatoon and in Saskatchewan? And so there's a bunch of those questions. And then some of them are about some of the big picture questions around policy and thinking about poverty reduction and so on. And it's interesting when I read through the questions, because that's actually what we usually see. Those of us who work in the area of food security is we're often sort of balancing these two sides. So what I would like to do now, just so that we make sure we have some time to have this conversation, is to talk a little bit about connections back to policy, connections back to the bigger picture structural issues that exist in our communities. So, when I read through the questions, there's questions about what's being done to work towards increasing social assistance rates. What about what's going on when it comes to living wage campaigns, guaranteed incomes, those sorts of things. And so I thought that I would put this towards all of you. In some ways, I feel like it's a bit of an unfair question to ask all of you, in that I know you're all right now really focused on those on meeting those emergency needs. But as somebody who has the privilege, and I recognize that as a privilege, to think about this in that structural context, I have a lot of questions about how we connect the dots back to the very serious structural problems that exist in our society. And so I'm wondering, as you've been doing your day-to-day emergency work, how have you, or what have you been thinking about when it comes to connecting this back to incomes, to racism, to, the problems that are really serious problems in our communities that we need to deal with in order to really deal with food insecurity?
I can do that. That's kind of the me question a little bit. I think that one of the outcomes of the COVID pandemic, and then the light shone on the systemic racism that we participate in the past few months and weeks, is that everything that came up in COVID have existed. It was all there. We knew that. The folks who work on this all the time, we knew it. We know it's there. And what I think is happening is the intensified, and the light shone really highly on these big cracks that we know exist in our society. And so I think the reality is I think that there's more appetite and there's more movement on actually solving some of these problems than there has been in a long time. And while I wish that we didn't have to deal with this pandemic or anything, I think it's beneficial that we are seeing, and everybody's really seeing and talking about some solutions in a way that is really interesting. And I think, like Laurie said earlier, that they didn't see the surge or spike in folks using the food bank. Sorry, Laurie, to talk over, to use your words, but and I wonder if one of them is because CERB came through for a large portion of our population, and that doesn't impact everyone, but we're basically trialing a universal what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry. A minimum income sort of idea. And I think it impacted food security. I think we didn't see the surges that we thought we would at the beginning, because people had money to then go to the grocery store, and people calmed down a little bit after that first surge of fear and stopped buying all of the flour on the shelves, right? So, I think this is good. So here locally, the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership has been working on these issues exactly for a long time, but they have their 12 bold ideas, and one of the, as we move away from some of the emergent responses in reopening and in transition in this time right now, what we're doing is we're shifting some of the folks who are really heavily involved in the interagency response back into that 12 bold ideas for poverty reduction. And where did we see movement in these emergent COVID times, and plugging that back into those bigger picture ideas, and so that we don't lose that momentum. And so if you haven't read those, it's a really great resource for those who are working in this area, is the 12 bold ideas, which addresses income and food security and all of those pieces as well.
If someone from the DSA could post a link to the 12 bold ideas in the chat, that would be really wonderful. Thank you. Does anyone else have any perspectives they want to share on this?
I think it's really important to amplify the solutions that folks have been talking about to some of the issues that we've seen, across this country and across the world. Free transit and a minimum basic income, the things we've all been calling for years, and people were calling for years before us. I think it's important not to lose the impact of that, and I hope that we are going to be able to speak to how some of those things and access to those things in our community helped folks along. So I know there's been some evaluation done of the interagency work, and I hope that we're going to be able to make really strong cases for the things that we've been advocating for years, because as you said, Chelsea, the pandemic really did shine a light on some of the worst issues that we're facing, and I think some of the solutions that popped up and how quickly they popped up, it's really important for us to ensure that we don't forget that. Sorry,
one thing, and to not lose the urgency. Like, COVID provided an urgency to these issues that we know are hard for so many in our cities and in our province and in our country, but the urgency and the shift that happens so quickly. So food security or poverty, it's an urgent issue. It's a now issue. And I think that sense of urgency is what the folks in the interagency response are going to capture and hopefully continue into that mobilization piece.
Does anyone else want to add anything?
I'll just mention, CHEP does fresh food markets in the first place because people don't have access. The grocery stores, they're all private for-profit organizations, and they move out to the burbs and set up these mega stores where there's, more money, leaving people in a large part of the city just not having access, to just be able to go buy fresh produce somewhere. That's an issue that you've done a lot with, Rachel, with the food deserts and the food swamps. Yeah. But that's the reality people face. They just don't have access.
Well, and I think access also looks different in a pandemic in that there's a lot more limitations on people. If you don't have a car, if you can't, Jolyn talked about income and not having sufficient income to buy in bulk, right? And those who did have sufficient income to buy in bulk were very much privileged, as they always have been, but that sort of was magnified. And then those folks who are purchasing a little bit of food kind of every couple of days, because that's what their income will permit, are really disadvantaged in this situation, because not only were all the public health messages telling us and continuing to tell us only shop once a week, at maximum only have one person from a household, which brings in a whole set of other issues when it comes to childcare, when it comes to sort of a different kinds of vulnerabilities or things that make it more challenging. But those food access issues, if you don't have access to a vehicle, and I know it was really felt in my neighborhood. I live in Caswell Hill, and Caswell Hill had a grocery store, right? We were one of the only inner city neighborhoods with a grocery store, but our grocery store closed for renovations right before the pandemic hit. And so there were a lot of people, a lot of chatter. We have a very, very active Facebook group in Caswell Hill, a lot of people asking for help with getting groceries in the neighborhood. So there's those kinds of issues have really been amplified during all of this, and I think that's part of what CHEP I think was aiming to try to help with by delivering to people's homes and so on. Does anyone have anything else to add on this question, or can I move on to another question? Good. Okay. So there are a number of questions, like I said, about sort of how are we going to increase general access to food in our communities? What are things that we can do? And again, I say this, I think these are important and we need to talk about them, but I also want to say one more time that food insecurity is not about food. It's about income. So let's keep that in the backs of our minds, but what are some of the food solutions that will help our community in general to just have be less dependent on the grocery stores, be more self-sufficient? And so there are questions about chickens, there's questions about gardening, there's questions about the role of the city and what the city could be doing when it comes to increasing access. So I know I'm assuming these questions come from cities like Victoria and Montreal, where they shifted instead of growing flowers in their city greenhouses, they started growing seedlings to give for free out to people in their cities so that they could grow their own food. So I think I'm not going to ask each one of the questions, but I'm going to ask a bit of a general question about your perspectives on really focusing on our self-sufficiency when it comes to food here in Saskatoon, but also I think in Saskatchewan in general.
I'll start just from a food bank and learning perspective. Over the last 10 years, we've been growing food on a vacant lot. It's not really vacant anymore because we've worked so hard to ensure that the soil is wonderful and there are bees there, and there are all kinds of things going on there. And we were really worried about not being able to run the programs at the garden patch this year, simply because we rely on so much volunteer labor there, and the way we grow. And what we decided in the end was that it was really important for us to continue, to grow food for the food baskets come harvest in the fall, but also to try and continue to do some education, some food literacy, some nutrition programming, all under that umbrella. And so the staff within that program worked really hard to ensure that everyone will be safe, that they're maintaining proper distance, that we aren't having large groups in there, but that we are continuing, some very entry-level-ish kind of education programs for folks, so that people are increasing their knowledge about growing food and preparing food as well. And the other shift is that our nutrition programming is moving online so that it will be accessible by folks who have access to that platform. And so we know that certainly doesn't reach as many folks as we'd like it to, but definitely pivoting so that we can provide some of that information and those programs online is important to us. So, just not closing every single thing that we do that provides access to information, knowledge about food was really important to us.
Anyone else want to speak on that?
I think with an indigenous or indigenous organization or population lens, I think food insecurity does have everything to do with income, but I think a lot of the thoughts transitioning or moving forward are looking at how we can build sustainability within the province. I know with the White Buffalo after school program, we've already been talking about and actually have our kids working in some of the food gardens, right, and working with and learning about the food gardens within the community. But now I'm reaching out to other communities, to other reserves, north of the city, east of the city, and talking to them about what their plans are. I know for my own community, muskegs slowly growing an orchard central to their within the reserve, and they have a large contingent of people working together there in how and growing not only the orchard but a community garden. So I think we kind of have to look at that with an urban perspective and say, how do we do that here? And how do we do that because of the large population here? How do we do that year round? And so we've already seen trends toward vertical gardens. We've seen trends towards, seedlings like you're talking about in Victoria, but and so I think on our end, from White Buffalo's perspective, we kind of have to look at how do we engage the youth to actively take part in those next steps and actively engage them in planning and what they would like to see and how, as individuals, how would they fit into that system? And so it's going to be a long conversation. It's not going to be over the next 3 months, but I'm looking at the next 5 years. How do we regrow, I guess, or pardon the pun, but or re-sow those roots, those ideas into this younger generation that they need to participate, that we want them to participate and we want them to lead us. I think that's an integral conversation that we have to have over the next the next half decade or even decade, and really push the envelope. I think Saskatchewan is progressive enough that we can really create not only a change within our own home community, but across the board, across North America. And, I think we're only at the beginnings of that conversation. I will have to, I do have to step aside, so I apologize for leaving early. We had an incident here. I hope everybody has a great day. I'll allow for another 5 or 10 minutes on my end. So if anybody has any questions of me, I can answer them in the chat.
I was actually going to ask you one question, if you're okay with it, Joan. So I was thinking, well, first of all, I wanted to say, for those of you who aren't aware of it, Muskeg Lake is really a leader, community. I know some of the folks like Alfred Gamble and Stephen Wigg who are involved in some of that work that's happening there, and it's pretty incredible work. And I think there's a lot of communities, including the city of Saskatoon, that could look to that to the work happening there in terms of what we could learn from it. But my question to you was one that I've been thinking about a fair bit is, there's a lot of people in the city of Saskatoon who are receiving traditional foods, country foods, wild foods from family members living outside of the city, living on reserve or living in rural communities. And I imagine during this, that those lines of access to traditional foods were cut off, and probably still are for a number of people. And I'm wondering about what's happening on that front to allow urban people to access their traditional foods. As someone who has access to those traditional foods and those supply chains, didn't quite dry up and they didn't quite close, but it was very limited. Here at the Buff, the first question asked that came from not only my community, but from the other 6 communities of the Saskatoon Tribal Council was, how many animals are you going to need? Where can we get this done? And of course, and what became of that is, with the partnership with the Saskatoon Wildlife Federation, they offered up animals, game as well to us, and they established a line that I wasn't aware of because I'm relatively new to this position, but that we can utilize the university to have animals tested. And so that in itself is I guess one of the positives that came out of this. I'd be more willing to use wild game. I'm a big fan of moose, moose and elk. The other piece of that is with our land-based teachings and and you'll see it within the schools and within some of the other CB organizations within the community. They're with the land-based programs, they're really looking at berries, medicine picking, and those methods. And so I think that next step within those conversations is preservation, not only a conservation piece of it, but preservation, and how do we teach the kids within our community how to can, jar, freeze. I was lucky enough to get, from my own mother, of course, 12 bags of frozen Roma tomatoes that were grown in Muskeg. And so, that really helped out on my end. And through that lesson, I'm looking, okay, how do we do that here? How do we, maybe those tomatoes are natural to Saskatchewan, right? But, or originated in Saskatchewan, but at least we're showing them that this is possible, and that we can start looking at becoming our own supply chain. I hope that answers your question. I kind of rambled off there, but my apologies. Thank you. And I appreciate you need to go. You've got an emergency to deal with, so I don't want to monopolize your time. I'm actually just going to post a link to a report that some folks worked on. I was part of that group on improving access to traditional foods for urban residing Indigenous people. I'm just going to post a link to it for those of you who are interested in this topic and thinking about it further. Okay, so I'm looking at the questions that we've got here. There's still lots of questions around things that we can do, ways that we can work to improve our resiliency, our self-sufficiency when it comes to food. So I was going to just open it. Does anyone have any other thoughts they want to add to the conversation on that topic in particular?
Kind of to add to what Joel is saying, but is we need to look at our use of land and what we're doing with it and how we can use it better, both urban and like across Saskatchewan, in a way that, because we do have control over that to a certain extent. So like what, for sustainability wise, in lots of different ways, but how do we create a system in which people are equitably able to access the food that is good for their bodies and souls, right? And so, but we can do that here in an urban way too. Like we have, what are we doing with land? How are we protecting it? How are we cultivating it? And what can we do with that? So just sort of some of those ideas that Jolyn touched on, but like, it's, I don't want people to think that just because we have some reserve ideas. I think integrating all of those practices and ideas, both urban and in rural settings, is kind of one of the ways we can big picture look at some of those things.
Anyone else? So one thing I would really strongly encourage everyone to do, if you feel comfortable doing so, maybe even if you don't feel comfortable doing so, is to communicate with whoever is, whether it's your municipal government, your rural municipality, your chief and council, your whoever are in positions of leadership in whatever community you're in, and tell them that food self-sufficiency is something that's really important to you and that they should be putting time and effort into this, that it's part of recovering from the pandemic, and it's part of ensuring that we don't have some of the crises that we've experienced over the last few months, that we have fewer of those. And I would add, they're also good in the long run, considering climate change and considering all the other, major issues that we're facing as communities. So I don't say that lightly. Please do tell people in positions of leadership wherever you are that this is important. And if you can get involved in that work in some way, I really do think that's important. Okay, so just looking at some of the other questions, might ask a couple more. I don't want to go too long. I know we have until 1:30, but I also know that everybody on this webinar is really busy. And so I think we've actually had a pretty darn good conversation given we've only had an hour. So I don't want to go too much longer. I'm just going through these questions and trying to see what else sort of, I've tried to group them in, and I'm going to look over here in the chat. So there's a question about looking ahead. How do you think your operations and approach to your work might change after COVID?
Phew, that's a big one, for sure. I have been reflecting on the last 3 months for a few days, well, for the last few months, but for a few days, about how during the health crisis part of the pandemic, we were very focused in, I think, so many of the organizations that we worked with in the interagency response groups, so innovative in the way that they flipped and adapted and changed. And then the support that we received from the interagency group around conversations around health and safety, but also around mental wellness and ensuring that those who you're responsible for, both your those that you serve and your employees, were well. And so much of that, it was so wonderful not to have to think about that in isolation. And so now that we're sort of faced with this reopen plan, of course, I think we're all encouraged to have the economy start up again and get folks back to some level of post-COVID activity. But it has created just a whole new way of us having to look at things. So the very question that's being asked, and it'll be a really long time before we can have folks in our areas where we serve people together. I'm sure it's the same for many organizations. And so there are still so many health and safety questions that we have to focus on that it does detract from us being able to think long term about policy change. And so making room for for the staff that we work with to be able to sort of help inform from what they've learned, help inform those conversations is really important. But I'll reiterate that I think it's more important now than before for us to work together on those poverty reduction strategies that A, we saw work during the pandemic, and B, we've been talking about for so long. So although many of the ways in which we work will have changed probably forever, what's been deepened and strengthened has been the collaboration. This community is really amazing. I've talked to colleagues across the country, and in very few instances are there food banks involved in the discussions around community development, poverty reduction in this pandemic. And so I feel really fortunate to be a part of this community.
I can go as well. The funny thing about this pandemic is that it was very similar to my regular work, just like super intensified, and maybe a little bit of a different scope in related to some of the solutions we were coming to. But working with the community organizations is generally my work, and so my hope is to take all of the new people that I know and have relationships now, and help support those broader conversations that maybe at an organizational level there is not capacity for. Some of our smaller community organizations who are part of this, they don't get to participate in those decisions or those conversations very, very much. So I'm hoping that I can keep those going and moving them forward in some of the policy discussion areas as well, which is the main focus of some of my work. I also want to address a question that I saw about, are there any groups or individuals that were completely unreached or unreachable, and what would be needed to reach them? Because absolutely, probably. And I think what the drawback of the response that we did is that we definitely helped all the people who are connected through the organizations. So the people who are unreachable are the folks who are not connected in to any organization in this city, and we absolutely probably did not reach those people. And what would be needed to reach them is this continued collaborative effort, this continued conversation, and hearing from the people we didn't reach. And then I did receive one kind of random report, but what I did was, based on that, I've reached out to a different organization who I actually didn't even know existed. But through my connections in the interagency response, I now have a relationship and a communication with the disability, I can't remember what they're called, a group of folks who support, or with organizations who support individuals with disabilities, sort of across the range of spectrum across the province. So I'm able to translate some of that food security information that wouldn't naturally flow through that system in that way. And I think that's been some of the power. So to think that we reached everyone I really don't think we did, but I think the organizations that I work with, what I saw was an amazing capacity to try to reach everybody. And that heart and thought. And when you hear Jolin speak, and he's not here to talk to this, so I will a little bit, but what I saw from White Buffalo and from SDC and the response there was that we have people who need food and we are going to feed them. And it was that simple. And I think that's sort of the power of some of what happened. And I think we reached more people than we would have if we didn't collaborate in the interagency response way.
Thanks. Does anyone want to add anything on that? So I think at this point, I want to kind of begin to bring us to a close. And I guess I would ask each of you, do any of you have anything further that you want to talk about? Is there anything that you haven't said that you would really like to say? I will start by saying that, the topics that we've been, today's topic is what I work on kind of day to day. And my, I think like Chelsea, I get to work on connecting, finding out what different organizations are doing and hopefully doing my best to amplify and, talk about their work and trying to support that in various different ways. I know that when it comes to the innovation that's happened in terms of alternative to school food programming, I've been involved in that work nationally, and we've got a survey out right now trying to capture some of the incredible innovation that has happened with schools across the country closing and trying to find ways to support families during this time. So if anyone is interested in that survey, would like to fill it out because you might be involved in that work in some way, I can post a link to the survey in the chat as well. And I would also say, that feel free to contact me if you have questions or if you want to be connected to others and so on. So I would just give each of you a minute or two to conclude if you have any sort of further comments that you'd like to make.
I always want to talk. I've also been thinking about, all the years that I've been able to interact with, all the panelists and all the folks who are involved in this kind of work, whether it be food security or poverty reduction. And every time we're together, the thing that keeps us there or conversing is food. It's so basic. We've been asked as a society to stay home and sort of fend for ourselves, and it isn't in our nature. So as a group of folks who work in a community-based organization, it's our nature to gather and to solve problems and to have food together. And so I've sort of really been thinking that this pandemic has, it has given us lots of opportunity, but it has sort of squashed some of our ability to break bread together. And I can't wait till we can get back to doing that. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go. Well, I'm just thinking of gardening, more people getting involved in gardening. We have this internship we hold every summer where we basically hire 5 youth, normally who have had no exposure at all to gardening and probably no interest. And then we, hook them on gardening. And it's interesting to see what's happened as a result. And so I'm just thinking, I look at all the lawns we have in the city and how people religiously water them, with our precious resource, potable water. And I think, we need to rethink that and look at how to grow food, you are taking control over your own food supply. You're able to at least exercise a measure of control over it. And I think that's something we really need to encourage. We have a short growing season. However, urban gardening can be practiced year round. And I think it's something we really have to start focusing on.
I was distracted reading Melanie's comment, and Melanie's a coworker of mine. But I agree. I think, for me, the learnings from working with the interagency group and the ability to figure out solutions on a smaller scale, I would like to work together still to create that capacity and that conversation and that will to sort of further these conversations. So as you heard today, but what can we do here, but what can we do provincially, what can we do going forward, and hoping that we are now afforded the opportunity to have some of the harder conversations that people maybe haven't been having, but also there hasn't been appetite to have either. And so I'm hoping that now is more open, and I think it is. And so I'm looking forward to moving forward from this, and I'll still be doing interagency response as well. So I'm just gonna smush it all together in my work, and that's what I'm doing going forward.
Thanks, everyone. I think I'll pass it back to Erin now to conclude.
And myself. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much. This was with Rachel, Laurie, Jean, Chelsea, and Joellen, even though you had to leave, for joining us, for sharing your experiences with the interagency and your insights. And just thank you everyone who participated and sharing your questions, both in advance and during the chat. And I know that this is really probably just, scratching the surface for many of us, but I think it was so important that we had this today. And from even some of the comments that I think there's lots of opportunity, hopefully, to continue the conversations and to get more engaged. If you missed any of our previous conversations, I will put the link in the chat. I'll do that right away, where you can check out any of our latest recordings and subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on upcoming conversations. If there are ways that we can make these conversations work better for you, just please let us know. We're going to take a bit of a break for the series just to actually sit back and reflect a little bit and think through how to move forward. So we're really looking for feedback and suggestions as well as topic ideas. So this really is your moment to let us know. I guess I'll just leave that in the chat right away. And thank you again, everybody, and please take care. Enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend.